US President Donald Trump is destroying the post-war international order. This is the official assessment of the 2026 Munich Security Conference, which kicks off in the German city on Friday. In its annual report released this week, the conference says the Trump administration is taking an axe to the existing world order. Europe is struggling to come to terms with this new reality, and global economic uncertainty looms as the world shifts toward a new normal. How is the Trump administration appending decades of international norms? How will Europe navigate this new world, and what's the view from China? Welcome to this edition of The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing with me, Liu Xin. Joining us today from Washington, D.C. is Peter Kuznick, a history professor and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. From Rome, Italy, Ivan Cardillo, chairman of the Italy-China Business Development Forum, and here in our Beijing studio, Professor Zhang Gong, professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Let's hear exactly what's written in the report. Now, the report says the world has entered a period of wrecking ball politics, sweeping destruction rather than careful reforms and policy corrections is the order of the day. The report also says the most powerful of those who take the axe to existing rules and institutions is US President Donald Trump. As a result, the report says more than 80 years after construction began, the US-led post-1945 international order is now under destruction. Peter, let me go to you first. How do you look at this assessment?
I think that's a kind assessment of what Donald Trump represents. Donald Trump is not only tearing up the Constitution in the United States, he is an aggressor on the world stage. If we look at some of his recent actions, bombing Iran, actually he bombed 7 countries in his first year in office. He invaded Venezuela, kidnapped the leader of Venezuela, threatened to take Greenland by force. He's threatened Canada, Panama, Mexico, Colombia, one country after another. His recent comment when he said, it was asked by the New York Times if there are any limits on what he can do, any constraints, he said, yeah, one thing, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me. He doesn't believe in international law. He just tore up the New START Treaty. He called for a board of peace, which is an attempt to replace the United Nations with him in charge. Even after he's out of office, he'll still be in charge. I mean, if he were not so dangerous, he would be a clown on the world stage. And behind his back, people laugh at him. But they know that there's nobody standing between him and the use of nuclear weapons. And so they know he's also rash, impulsive, delusional. I'll give you an example of delusional. He was given.
Maybe for the sake of time, let's not expand here, but I got how you assess the terminology of this year's Munich Security Conference. Let me turn to Ivan, who's in Italy, and get his view. Ivan, now this year's theme of this report is under destruction. Also, you know, the video promotion of the conference is a big elephant in the room, and certainly there is no hiding behind thin veils in terms of the language in this year's report. Although last year it was talking about multipolarity, how do you see the shift in the theme and the language of this year's Munich Security Conference report?
On one side, we see an emotional reaction from the European perspective. Europe has been relying on the United States for decades. So the new USA attitude is really a game changer for Europe. So I see there like an emotional reaction, but also the idea that everything now is under condition. So all the new concept, trust, everything became conditional, and it's not related to anything stable or predictable like laws or international rules or international order. Everything is un, under condition, but also under negotiation. Everything is negotiable and mostly transactional. So these, contribute to the creation of an environment of lack of stability, trust, and basically fears. So here we see an awakening of conscience in European leaders' mind somehow. Um, Days ago, Europe also published a report on the future of EU and US relations, and there we really see also the idea of trying to the need to find a new balance.
Professor Gong, is this an echo to the speech, now very famous, by the Canadian Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, at Davos when he talked about rupture across the Atlantic?
Yeah, well, I think what his characterization is very much on the point. I think, this essentially what we call the reckoning of the U.S.-European relationship by the United States, by Washington, is, in my view, is long overdue. I think it's just a matter of time that people like Trump will come to power in Washington and will do something like this. I think the overall tone of this report, I sort of agree. And sort of also disagree, by the way.
What do you disagree?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of agreement about what we agree on. In terms of a disagreement with this report, I think the authors of this report are still very much living in the past. Especially when it comes to Chapter 3, when they talk about China. They lump China with the United States, with Russia. They don't view it as a partner for charting a course forward. They still view China as a threat, a challenge to the security and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. And they still view China as a distortionary force in international trade system, without mentioning, for example, there's a slew of anti-WTO trade policies introduced by the European Union, pretty much tailored design for China. It doesn't mention any of these things. And on the other hand, it just accuses China for this and for that. So I think my overall assessment is that this report speaks some truth, but not the whole truth. And overall, I think these authors are still very much living in the past.
We'll come to more details with that in just a moment. But still, concerning the relationship across the Atlantic, Peter, I find it, and many people find it actually very explicit. First the language, and then they named names. They placed the blame squarely at the foot of U.S. President Donald Trump, a pretty damning assessment of the U.S. president. How do you look at that?
Trump is a human wrecking ball, as I said. But he's not the only one. We could trace this back to U.S. policy in Vietnam. We could trace it back to Kosovo. We could trace it back to the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. We can trace it back to Libya. There's so many examples of the U.S. creating this kind of post-war international order and rules, and then breaking them at will. Donald Trump is just more blatant about it. In the past, the U.S. would try to present itself as fighting for freedom and democracy and higher ideals. Trump has no interest in that. Trump is openly transactional, and he says that he's going to be governed by the law of the jungle. This is very dangerous on a global scale. Nobody else talks like that. Sometimes people act like that in a very limited way, but we've not seen anybody since World War II who's thought that he could get away with being such a bully.
So, Peter,
in that way.
Yeah, Peter, is it about Trump, or is it about the U.S. system? Is it about the changing times? Do you think in a couple of years' time, when there is a new president in the United States, the relationship will go back to where it was?
I doubt it. I can't imagine that the world will trust the United States, partly because they know that in 2 years or 4 years, there's going to be somebody else in there. who could revert to the kind of things that Trump is doing. So I know the level of distrust now is higher than it's ever been, and it probably makes sense. But that doesn't mean that the Europeans are very wise in their own policies. I mean, their hostility, as Professor Kong was saying, toward China, their hostility over a long period of time toward Russia, their attempt to inflict a defeat on Russia in Ukraine, rather than finding a reasonable alternative there. We don't have the kind of diplomats we need now. If Xi Jinping can play that role, that would be great, because we need win-win diplomacy rather than zero-sum game diplomacy. And diplomacy itself had become a dirty word during the Biden years. So the United States, I don't know if we're going to come back from this, but there's going to be a change. The Republicans are going to lose the House of Representatives almost certainly in November. And the Democrats, things are going to change in the United States. And Trump is way below water when it comes to popularity and approval ratings. He's at historic lows in the United States.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, again, the dilemma facing European leaders at this moment, Ivan. It seems that they have realized that the era where they can hide under the U.S. protection umbrella is over, that the U.S.'s support of Europe is conditional. But on the other hand, they have this strategic autonomy dilemma. Ivan, what do you think is the dilemma that European leaders are faced with as reflected in this report?
Well, European leaders, they have to develop a united policy and attitude towards certain themes. Now, for many years, European Union didn't really act like a union. So this also undermines some strength of such a political entity called European Union. So it was too diversified, the member states' action, specifically in terms of foreign policy and defense. Now we see that they are starting discussing the idea of being more united, but still they want to protect NATO. So maybe we might see a stronger European pillar within the NATO, or maybe we can NATO still remain a cornerstone for the defense of European Union, or maybe develop a stronger military strategy. This can be more important because, again, also NATO is under attack, if we want to use under destruction, the words of the report. Discussions are going on. In few days, also in February, there are still new meetings discussing specifically addressing this topic. So a realistic answer will be that Europe protects Europe, and they will still find a way to see if that will happen within NATO or with something new that they're going to develop by themselves.
Let me move on to get the view of Professor Gong on this. If European leaders have finally woken up, are they seeing any possible way ahead for the future, a way out of the dilemma?
Well, I'm a little bit skeptical. I think, first of all, there's a fundamental issue about economic power. You look at the European countries, practically each one of them is heavily into the national debt, and they're struggling with domestic issues. And now they're talking about spending more money on defense, 5%. This is actually a huge political implications for their constituencies. And also there's the issue of unity. I'm not even sure whether all these 20-some member states would come to terms with a common strategy when it comes to defense. I don't think countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, would be so much interested in spending that much money on defense. And as they don't see there's a threat from Russia. And honestly, I don't believe that Russia has an intention of invading Europe. I think probably it is true that this kind of sort of like a hybrid warfare going on between Russia and some European countries. But you have to take a step back and ask why Russia is doing this, right? You see some of the European countries are indeed heavily involved in this war in Ukraine, and to be honest, some countries even have boots on the ground, and from a third point of view, third independent position point of view, it's quite natural to explain Russia would respond something like this. So I think on this particular matter, actually, I'm totally in agreement with President Trump. Let's come up with some kind of a negotiated solution and stop the killing and stop this conflict. To be honest, I don't think the Europeans have harboring any hope of defeating Russia in Ukraine. What they are doing right now is just to keep fighting going on. Fighting is no longer the means to an end. It is the end for them. They just want to keep Russia engaged in Ukraine, and keep fighting. And this is indeed their strategy.
So are European leaders continue to be very painful given the situation? Because there's no way out if they continue going down the same way of thinking, same mentality.
Yeah, well, I think it's very difficult, and I think it's probably more challenging to these current leaders is the political seismic change in their own countries. I would expect that in the future elections in these countries, some of these leaders would be just pushed aside, and there's going to be a new wave of European leaders having a totally very different view about how Europe should work together and how Europe should work on defense issues in the future.
Let's talk about China. As Professor Gong just said, the authors of this report pretty much kept a very similar tone, at least from last year's report, where they talked about China as a pacing threat, to borrow words from the United States. Peter, how do you look at the views of European policymakers as reflected in this report? Have they understand to the fullest extent possible the perception of China, the potential role of China in terms of helping Europe deal with some of the security issues it's faced with?
I think the tone of the report is very different than the actual actions that we're seeing on the part of European leaders toward China. The more they move away from the United States and from Trump's trade wars against his allies, not only against his adversaries, against his allies, they are looking for an escape hatch, and China represents that to a great extent. So many of them have been going to China, meeting with Xi Jinping, meeting with Wang Yi, other Chinese officials, and increasing economic relations between Europe and China. They're also softening toward Russia in some ways, but as Professor Gong says, the European leaders don't want to go that direction. To build on some things that Professor Gong said that I agree very much with, you look at the approval ratings of these European leaders. Macron is between 11 and 15%. Starmer is under 18%. Merz, the last I saw, was 23%. They have no support from their own populations. So the European publics want to see peace, but the European leaders don't at this point.
What is the problem here? What's behind this disparity?
The head of the Munich Security Conference said that Ukraine has got to keep fighting because if they stop, then Russia's going to come after Europe. That's craziness.
That's crazy.
Russia is having a hard enough time with Ukraine. It's not going to want to take on NATO.
So what's propelling these policymakers to talk in this way? Is it pride? Is it arrogance? Is it to keep the facade that they are right, they are not wrong? Peter, in one word, what would you put it? How would you put it?
I would say that they've got to scare the European publics into accepting this increased defense spending. Instead
Okay.
of looking for ways to have more peaceful relations
Ivan.
with Russia and China, they'd rather scare them into accepting
Okay.
irrational defense spending because the money's coming out of the education,
I
the
see.
Yeah.
housing, the social programs that they need.
Ivan, let me go to you. There's also a poll, annual poll, which is also conducted by the Munich Security Conference called the Munich Security Index. And results of the poll pretty much showed what Peter was just saying. The people in Europe, in G7 countries, for instance, they don't really see Russia as the top threat, as the institution puts it. They don't really see China as a pacing threat. Actually, the popularity of China, the favorability of China has been increasing over the past years. Why there is such a divergence in terms of how the authorities, how the policymakers view the security threats to Europe and those of the populace?
This is just a different perspective. Security elite focus on long-term structure threat, while population and public opinion focus on the immediate cost of living risks. And this is exactly what it is. I mean, it's been mentioned that European leaders has a very low rate of popularity. We are discussing how the war is impacting on common people life and cost, and this is exactly the point. So we are on the cornerstone where people, they need to pay more for oil and gas coming from the United States and not Russia anymore. They need to pay more the energy costs.
But are you implying,
As I
Ivan, are you implying that the policymakers are right in describing Russia as a long-term serious threat and China as a long-term pacing threat?
Oh no, no, I don't think they are right. I think simply that they need to find their own strategic autonomy that is not existing. I mean, why the narrative about the Russian invasion? Because they still need to buy arms from the United States. I mean, the country making money out of the war is the United States. So basically, the time when Europe have the strength and the courage to stand for itself, it's more easy. I mean, China, Europe, and Russia, they are in the same continent. So it's very, you can basically go to Beijing by driving a car. So, I mean, it takes time, but
A
it's
walk.
possible. Also, a walk, like many people did also during the centuries. And so I believe that something will shift. And but also that in terms of regulation,
Yeah.
if you look at Cybersecurity Act and what is happening, still there is the need for security. But again, the attitude is becoming better towards China, I believe.
Let's take a more optimistic attitude towards what's happening. And China seems to be putting a lot of importance in its relationship with Europe. China's top diplomat, Mr. Wang Yi, is going to participate in this year's Munich Security Conference, and he was just meeting Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, where both sides hail bilateral ties and talk about future closer ties of cooperation. Professor Gong, what is China hoping to achieve by sending certain messages at the conference? What kind of message do you think Mr. Wang is going to send?
Well, first of all, Europe is hundreds of thousands of miles away from China, and we don't have any design on Europe at all. Our attitudes towards Europe is nothing more than everything but being friendly to European countries and cultivate mutually beneficial economic relationships. We have no design of stationing any troops there. I just don't understand why Europeans are talking about anything representing a security risk from China, right? We're not exporting ideology. We are not inciting any sort of a political movements in Europe. So I think, China, from China's perspective, we are willing to cultivate good relationship with each one of these countries in Europe. And indeed, there are those mutually beneficial opportunities. But the problem is that, some European countries, they still view China as a threat in the area of economic and technological power, for example. And some other countries, have their own political agendas, and they don't want to see China being more influential in Europe in terms of, economic cooperation in that area. So I think that's the problem here, and I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi, by going to Munich, by getting the message across that China is indeed willing to cultivate good relationships with the major European powers. And particularly at this moment, I would say particularly at this moment, where cooperation between Europe and China are very much imperative. And I want to mention one thing. I think in terms of maintaining the current rules-based order, we call it rules-based order, including some of the most important international institutions, the European side and the Chinese side do have a common interest in maintaining these organizations. For example, the WTO, we still want to work together to maintain these. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's wrap up in the reaction, the possible reaction from the United States and what's going to unfold during the conference. Peter, the United States has not taken this year's annual report very pleasantly for obvious reasons. What do you foresee unfolding in the foreseeable future between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean?
It's interesting that Trump's base is splitting over the Epstein files, which is the big news. Pam Bondi's testimony before Congress yesterday was a huge embarrassment to Trump's base. So we see them going in different directions, but they're trying to paper a lot of it over. Trump pushes and pushes, but if people push back, Trump backs down. His nickname in the United States is Taco. As for Trump, always chickens out. We've seen this in the trade wars.
When it comes to Europe, is he going to chicken out?
Is Trump going to chicken out now? He doesn't have as many cards to play as he thinks he does. But he's creating a very dangerous situation. By eliminating the New START treaty, there are no more nuclear arms control treaties in effect. His own director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, issued a video on June 10th in which she said the world is closer to nuclear annihilation today than it's ever been. And then you had Sergei Narishkin, the head of the Russian intelligence agency, GRU, say in October that civilization is the most fragile point it's ever been since World War II. So people have got to take these international crises very seriously now. And there's a lot of discussion. We saw what Takayuchi said about Japanese troops going to Taiwan.
Absolutely. It is a very dangerous time. I have to wrap up very quickly. So one quick word to Ivan, one quick word to Professor Gong. What's potentially the biggest implication for this destruction? Are we going to see outright military conflict, wars? What do you expect, Ivan? Very briefly. 10 seconds if you can.
I foresee the creation of new regional partnership, bilateral or multilateral agreements between outside the NATO, WTO, or new patterns of cooperation based on common shared interest and contingent interest. So not long-term visions, but reactions to urgencies caused by this disruption.
Professor Gong.
I think in this new world, I think it's extremely important to have stable relationships among major powers, especially I think between China and the United States and Russia, Russia and China, and China with European countries as well, European Union as well. I think the stable relationship, peaceful relationship, fair competition, it should be the main themes of the future.
Okay, but for the time being, we don't need to stay up overnight and worry about this. Not yet. Okay, especially not when the Chinese are celebrating the Chinese Lunar New Year. We have to wrap up there. We're running out of time. Thank you so much to Professor Peter Kuznick, Mr. Ivan Cardillo, and Professor Zhang Gong for your insights. And with that, we come to the end of this live edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.